Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been, oh, excuse me, I'll change the audio here a bit. It's been delightful for me personally to spend time working on this, thinking through it. And working on a topic like this will absolutely be beneficial for me because I'll need to turn around and implement some of the things I'm talking about. So there's just things that have helped me personally. And I hope maybe some of this will be helpful for you as we talk through it also. I'm going to give you a link now because I don't want to forget it. Here's the link. And some of you could already put that into a smartphone and pull it up what's here. If you will permit, if you can wait a little bit. So I intentionally did not give this early. What this is just the PDF of everything we'll talk about. And I would prefer, if we can, just so that we stay engaged together and talk through it, so that you're not looking ahead and seeing where I'm going with something. And I'll ask you some questions and such as we go. But I also want you to have the information. So this is bit.ly. So that's an L / and then it's just GFA MAT 19. It is case sensitive here. So you do need to make sure you get all caps. Okay, so if you put that down, put that into a browser, it's going to pull up my notes, and then you can get the PDF of this, everything that we're going to talk about tonight. So let me just introduce briefly where I'm coming from as I think about, or kind of my personal background as I think about coming into this topic. We arrived here in an existing team. It's a fairly large team. Actually, if I'm correct, I think we are the largest team that GFA has on one field. We have 5 career families, we have 3 career singles, and then we have 3 short-term singles. And when we arrived 6 years ago, the team already had a good history established. So the most recent full-time family that was there had been there 8 years. And then if you go out from there, one of the families had been there for, let's see, do the math, 10 years. The other family had been there for 20 years. Okay. And so some of these groups have, or these couples have relationships that go back a decade. And that makes it a little interesting from our standpoint because, okay, here we are, we're the newcomers. Furthermore, the previous couple that had intended to come just a little bit before we came, visited, did some survey stuff, and then ended up not coming. So some of that could possibly be in the head a little bit too. If let's say a setting that you're going into, then there was, let's say the last guy who came, this wasn't our case, but the last guy who came in and blew everything up. And it was a big mess. Okay. When you arrive, that is now part of your history, even though you had nothing to do with it. And I think it's helpful just to recognize some of those realities. These are factors that affect the way people are thinking. 6 years later, I'm still very much learning, very much trying to understand, and finding my place in the team, though we have a great working relationship. I feel very, very comfortable and view the men that I'm working with as some of my best friends, but it's still just learning. And it's definitely ongoing kind of learning process. Now, the interesting dynamic of this within the last 3 months is we have a new couple that just arrived. And so we're watching that process happen in reverse. I'm no longer the newcomer. And so watching what it looks like for a newcomer to fit into the team, and a team that now we're a bit more familiar with and how that works. One other piece that's background for us is that we had a fairly unusual experience. We attempted at one point, we were headed to a different mission field, and we were going to join a different team there, and again, a very large team that was troubled. So there was some tension, and eventually those relationships didn't work out. But altogether, we spent about 6 months in that context and got to know that team fairly well. Because there was tension within the group, I kind of became an earpiece at times. And so we heard a lot. And that was an interesting dynamic to just see how it could work in a not terribly great way. All that to say is in terms of what I'm bringing into this discussion, I would say I do have a serious experience gap in dealing with difficult teams, because our team has been just incredibly gracious with us and an incredible blessing to work with. So that's some of the background that I'm bringing as I talk through this. Here are the concepts that I would like to talk with you about tonight. And we'll start out with this and we'll develop it a little bit further. But why is it so hard? Meaning, why do team relationships so often, well, why are they so eponymous for not working out? Second, both the newcomers and the old timers, I struggled with that word. Old timers sounded strange. Veterans, it sounds like it's a war. So anyway, whatever. Both newcomers and old timers feel the strain of the change. Thinking of team relationships under the metaphor of marriage, don't sweat the details, but you should sweat the core fundamental pre-commitments. Spend time with your coworkers, but not too much time. And then just in conclusion, some kind of foundational notions that I'd be glad to talk about further. Okay, so that's the basic outline. And it's just not a super parallel outline, but just different pop in my head there. Start out with this, why is it so hard? And the question I'm asking there, really, truly, teams on the mission field are eponymous for failure. So we recognize the incredible benefits of a team and a team relationship. To me, foremost among all of those that pops in my head is just accountability. And we know this as missionaries, you know this. Your supporting churches want to keep you accountable, but what can they do? Even GFA is providing as much help and support as really is plausible to expect. But who really knows you? Who really knows how good you actually are in the language? Who knows how diligent you are? Who knows if you're a jerk, if you're hard to get along with, and if you're demeaning? Nobody who really knows those things. The people who really know are your teammates. They know you. And they know you down to the core level of what your daily life looks like. Okay, so that's a huge benefit. And yet, why then do these relationships tend to be so troubled? Or why are they eponymous for failure? To the degree that I've heard a mission board, non-GFA, mission board directors say something like, at some point they wondered, is it worth it? Because they end up putting out so many fires with these particular sets of relationships. Okay, let me start out, and I'm going to dismiss one, or I'm going to sharpen my question first, and let me try to make the question a little sharper. What I'm asking is not why are relationships hard. We know that, particularly, if you're a married person. Okay, relationships take work, right? So we're not just asking why are relationships hard. What I'm really wondering is why do cross-cultural missions relationships turn into such a struggle? And so I'm not even asking, like, let's say a business might go abroad, set up a business, and business partners who are only working for money, one guy might be a liberal and the other guy's a conservative, and they still can make the business work, right? Or maybe church planners in the US there's going to be struggles there too, but they might have an easier time than a specifically missions group that's working together. Why are missions groups so eponymous for failures? And I'm going to start out with one explanation that I'd like to kind of dismiss out of hand. And then I'm going to ask you to take a couple of minutes and ponder a bit if you would have some reasons that come to your mind. Okay, so here's one that I would like to somewhat dismiss. We could use the logic that Satan is tripping us up because missions is so important. And so that's what explains the difficulty of missions relationships or team relationships. I'm not opposed to the logic per se, in the recognition that Satan is the accuser of the brethren. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. Even the logic flow of Ephesians moves from God's glory in the church. And so because it's important to God, then I move into Ephesians 6, Satan wants to destroy it, right? So that logic is valid logic for sure. Just to sharpen the question, I'm not really asking why the relationships between believers would be so hard. I'm asking why missions would be so hard. And here's where I'm a little reluctant to just say that it's strictly because Satan is tripping us up. In a way, it turns into a kind of a backwards self-compliment that goes something like, we can't get along, we can't work out our relational differences because we're so important. and more helpful than kind of giving ourselves this compliment for our importance because we fail, more helpful would be to avoid the whole fatalism. Well, Satan is tripping us up. We can't do anything about it. And instead, look for some deeper factors that I think are very real. Obviously, for sure, Satan is accusing us. But let's go a little further and let's process why missions, relationships, specifically missions, would be challenging. So let me give you, and I'm going to go fast just because of time, but let me give you like 60 seconds. If you've got a paper there, or a pencil, or paper and a pencil, hopefully, or more likely a cell phone, give me a couple of thoughts. What would be things that are specific here to the missions situation? And comparing why a missions team would be, say, more difficult than a team relationship doing church planning in the US. Okay? Just give me a couple of thoughts. See what you come up with for maybe the next 60 seconds. We're just writing things down for now. I'm just working by ourselves. Okay, I'm going to pause you, and I apologize for that. I also apologize for this. I would love to if I was in person there, I would love to take feedback back from you. I think the communication this direction might be a little more challenging. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to give you the list of things that came to my mind. And then probably more profitable would be, I think you have a session at the end of the week where you go through some things. Some of these things maybe could come up there. You could hit the things that I missed in that setting working together. But here are, I think, 5 things that came to my mind that are specific missions things that make it harder. Number 1, you're under the strain of cross-cultural adjustment, maybe even adverse living conditions. Okay. We understand that those kinds of realities certainly affect marriages. And the logic of this would go, if the pressure of living in a place where it's hot and whatever, traffic, pollution, you can't get clean water, et cetera, whatever those regular natural strains built into your context are, those are going to affect relationships, and they're going to affect cross-culture, or they're going to affect teammate relationships. So sometimes the tension between people is just stress, and that's going to be a reality. 2, you're often working on joint projects. In our case, we're at a college, so we share this project together. This project, all of us are pouring our lives into it together, right? Okay, we have this shared vision, and we have to make decisions down to things like how we're going to spend money. And yet, we are, in a way, all independent actors in the sense that we are all our own boss, in a way. If you think about a business on the mission field, the boss could say, okay, I want so-and-so to go do this, so-and-so should go do this now. And he's paying your paycheck, okay? But my paycheck is independent. And so there's not a direct tie between my immediate superior, Dr. K directs the college. There's not a direct tie between him and my paycheck. And so it could, if you thought about this wrong, turn into a thing where, well, I can just do what I want because I raised my own support. I raised my own funding. I came in here as an independent missionary. And therefore, it's only by choice that I would be part of the group, right? And so there's kind of not teeth to the relationships as they go because we're all independently supported. Number 3, cross-cultural aptitude, linguistic skills, and accumulated experience, meaning how many years somebody's been on the field. All of those things vary widely, very, very different between individuals. And so that's going to make a huge difference on everything in life. The guy who has great language skills is going to find it a lot easier to just navigate life. And the guy over here, maybe the guy over here has been here longer, but he doesn't speak the language. And so all of the logistics of working through life are pain for him, right? So this is, but you can't, these are just people. People are going to be different, and they're allowed to be different. Number 4, I think it's number 4. Yes, number 4. In our home cultures, we make a lot of practical decisions by just copying what our fellow church members do. This is a bit of a concern for me, but a lot of our practical theology is just done by proxy. We don't necessarily think through our decisions. We just copy the people around us. That can be good or bad, I suppose. Living cross-culturally isn't that simple. And so in a cross-cultural context, you have to kind of reinvent the wheel. You have to figure it out for yourself all the way from ground zero. And when you do, your conclusions might be different than your teammates' conclusions. So now, and I'll build this idea later, now we've got people that have worked through life philosophy, practical theology questions, and came out at different places. And if you're not processing it correctly, and you feel like your conclusion was way better than theirs, then it's going to be a recipe for disaster, right? And then 5, the heroic model of missions sets us up to be impossible to get along with. I saw a session later on talking about missionary biographies and the helpful use of those. If you read certain biographies, and that's all that you're thinking about in terms of missions, and then the assumption is that missions looks like William Carey, Adoniram Judson, David Livingston, okay? And so then you go in as part of a team, and you're the hero who's going to, I've come and I'm going to solve the problem of the Philippines. Who wants to live with a guy like that? Okay. And so if my expectations are set so high that I can't get along with anybody else, this can set us up for failure. So if I put those 5 points together, I think I can come up with a decent explanation for why ministry teams of missionaries on the field struggle in a greater way than maybe your average church planning team might struggle, or more than a business might struggle. Because there are some fundamental, inherent, even kind of philosophical differences that make the situation so different and make it challenging, particularly challenging. Okay, so the next thing I would like to talk about is just the reality that the strain here for coming into a mission team or joining a team of people in ministry. The strain here is felt both by newcomer and veteran. And again, if you're thinking through these two, okay, here you have the existing team, you have the group of people that have already been there. Now the new guy comes in. Everything in the structure of how the old team worked was kind of set. The new guy comes in, everything has to reconfigure, right? And so the arrival of the new guy is affecting everybody. Everybody has to shift because he came. So I'll process this for just a moment for both. I'm going to talk about the newcomer first. The newcomer has to find his place and has to carve out a new niche for himself. He has to learn the map of how the relationships work. There's already an invisible network of how all of these people are relating to one another. And that's already there. They already know a lot of that. They already know the lines and where things go and how things connect. And the newcomer has no clue. So the things that the newcomer has to figure out early on in this process, just to know how he fits into the team and kind of to carve out his niche or carve out his place within the team, just to relate effectively with everyone, would go like this. Questions like, who are the idea influencers? Within the group, there are certain people who have a disproportionate amount of influence on the ideas. Who in the group tends to be a conserving, contracting force? Who tends to be an advocate for the status quo? And on the other hand, who tends to push the scope of ideas outward? You need both. Both have their role, and so we need each other. Okay, but learning who that is a big part of being part of the team and being effective. Who is willing to push to get their viewpoint implemented? Everybody's sitting around the table, but some people will, let's say if they're on a scale of 1 to 10, they're like a 3 in commitment to this idea. I mean, they think it's a good idea. They're not super excited about it. And yet the way that they'll communicate it, it sounds like it's a 7 or something. Okay? And so just learning that versus the other guy who really believes in it like a 9, but he's an understater. And so he says it as if it's a 2. Okay. Learning how strongly in their communication style they come across. So how hard will a person push on their idea? Who's being a silent thinker? And maybe they're concerned, they're bothered, but they're just not going to say it. When a person expresses their views, are they overstating? Are they understating? Okay, well, all of that's built into our personalities, and it's okay, it's allowed. You just have to learn it. You have to learn who those people are, or maybe how they would tend to express themselves like that. Where are the relational alliances or the strong ties? Where are there already relational strains? Where are there maybe some impersonal differences or interpersonal differences that may not even be bad? It's just the recognition that, again, people are different and there could be a history and maybe a conversation was had or something and people worked through it and that tension healed over time. But it's there. It was a lesson learned. Okay, well, understanding that kind of helps you fit into part of the team. So the newcomer, I think, needs to work at being a student of his coworkers, really observing, really watching, really learning, asking questions, and being a listener all the time. So that's here. I have these two practical suggestions for the newcomer. Practical suggestion number one, you don't have to do exactly what everyone else does. Okay? In terms of, they have come up over the last 10 years, 15, 20 years, they have come up with strategies for life, for how to function in their context. And so they worked out some things that had pros and cons and so forth. They came to conclusions. You don't have to do exactly what they did. In fact, I would suggest waiting. Give yourself time before you start making irreversible decisions, right? Hopefully in the first 6 months, you won't commit yourself to a long list of ministries that then are going to set what you do for the rest of your career there. Wait, give yourself time. Talk to all of the missionaries on the team. Don't be selective within the group. You listen to the advice of like the 2 guys, but there's these 3 other guys over here. Talk to all of them. Ask all of them questions. And so that would be my second piece of advice here, or second, recommendation. Ask lots of questions. Learn from other people's mistakes. Talk to all of the missionaries. Be a listener for a long time, right? And just ask lots of be a big ear. Be like 90% ear and 10% mouth for a long time. And just gather as much information as you possibly can. Okay, so that's my attempt at thinking through the newcomer side. Let's talk about the veteran side and just process what's going on for the veteran when the team arrives. For the veteran, the team was already working before you came, or maybe it wasn't working, but in any case, it existed. And it was a known. People, I think, tend to prefer the status quo by default. There's some literature on this that will say if people have an option, it's the devil versus what's the rest of the expression? I forget. But the devil versus the unknown, right? And it's the whole concept that if you look into the future and it's a big question mark, that's scary. So we would prefer generally, even if we don't super like the status quo, we would prefer to stick with it because at least we know it. And the reality then of the newcomer coming in is that there are all these unknowns surrounding your arrival. What will you be like? Will you mess up the team? Will you send shockwaves through you? If you want to think of the metaphor of like smooth water and then somebody drops the pebble in the middle and all the ripples go out. Okay, so everybody has to reconfigure now. They all had their spot, but now everybody has to move and create a new spot for you. That's work. And the veterans are a little nervous about what this means. How are you going to change things once you arrive? Newcomers tend to be the most idealistic. That's idealistic. If I say it that way, it sounds maybe negative, as in it sounds naive. Idealistic, naive. Well, another way to say it, maybe philosophically pure. They've just read all the books. They've just sat through the missions classes. And so you could say it's naive. It's not real to the world. In another way, hey, all of us mission creep. We get in a place, and over the years, we kind of lock into a certain way of doing it. Maybe we need somebody to stir the pot every once in a while. So all of us can benefit from that. And so they might come in, though, the newcomer might come in and say things a little too sharply, or they might be a little too cut and dry at the beginning because they just think about, I just sat through the Mark Vowles classes in the missions major, and this is it. This is the way it has to be done. Okay. They might say things a little too sharply at the beginning. They might set a high standard right at the beginning, that even could make the others feel like they aren't being good enough missionaries. And it could make you feel a little insecure, maybe. When this new person comes in, we just had this new arrival. The top globes just came. They're doing great. They're doing fabulously well. I see them do things and I think, I should do that. Okay. So yeah, it could make you feel insecure. Hopefully it helps challenge you a little bit, push you forward a little bit. How I want to process that. It's really good. Let me learn from these people. They're seeing it with a fresh perspective, and let me grab that from them. On the other hand, let me give you an example of failure in this way. So when we arrived, again, I came in, really, really highly committed to certain ideals. One of them was language learning. And so I believed in it very, very deeply, and I still do. Not everybody in our team had the privilege that we had, which was we got to be out of everything for a year. Because for some people, they came in and had to jump right in. And that was life. That was the providence of God for them. So looking back on that now, from the perspective of 6 years later, I think I said some things that were too sharp. I said some things about my own commitment to language learning that I believed in, but it wasn't gracious, and it shouldn't have been said that way. It wasn't helpful. Okay. My teammates, and here's why I say this, my teammates, so they would be in the veteran category as we're talking about this example, my teammates were incredibly gracious with me and just let that stuff go. And it could have been offensive, and they could have just cut me off. Okay. But my teammates were incredibly kind and letting that kind of stuff go. So here later on, I'll get to this in a second, but the suggestion would be give a little bit of grace, extra grace as the veteran, right? The response when the newcomer comes in and maybe says those sharp things or has the high ideals, the response could be for the veteran to be tempted to want to curb their enthusiasm. Hey, slow down there, Tiger. Right? It could be tempting to expect the newcomer to wait their turn. Okay, so here, veteran has been on the field for 15 years, and he's built this church, or he's invested his life into this church. He's built up this institution. He's poured himself into it. Why should I then just have this new guy come in that's 20 years my junior, knows nothing about my situation, and to just hand him the keys for this thing that I've invested my life in for all of these years? Well, you probably shouldn't just hand him the keys right away. But reality is you do need to, little by little anyway, invite him in to some of the decision-making process. Don't shut him out. Let him be part of things. And I'm, again, very, very grateful to my team for the way that they handled our arrival like that, really allowing us to be part of things from the very beginning, and being willing to let us make mistakes and being patient with us when we did. So practical suggestions here that I would give on the veteran side of this. Number one, don't look down on the newcomer's naivete. We were all there once. We all came in as fresh arrivals and made all those mistakes. Related to that, don't forget how hard it actually was to adjust. And I see myself, this is happening to me. I'm only 6 years out, but I am forgetting some of it. Everybody forgets some of it. It feels like home now, right? Well, it doesn't feel like home for them, and that's okay. So we have to give them time to let them adjust and to work through some of that. Be there and be ready to help the newcomer. Regularly ask them how they're doing. Don't feel like they have to follow everything you did. Give them space to be different. Let them even make mistakes, but be there for them. And even as you let them make mistakes, maybe the metaphor here would go, I have young kids down to a little baby. Okay, I don't follow my child around and keep her from falling. I don't follow her around and keep her from every little bump and bruise. Basically, my goal, I want to keep her from making any permanent mistakes. Right? I don't want a finger cut off in the fan. We keep fingers out of the electrical sockets. Okay, we're trying to keep any major damage from happening. But if she falls and gets a bruise or a skinned knee, that is part of the learning process, learning to get around. Okay, and so in a parallel way, I don't have to micromanage, or you don't want to micromanage the newcomer, but you do want to help them maybe not make a mistake that would be crippling to their ministry long term. Specific example here would be strongly encouraging them to do language learning at the very beginning. Insist that their first year is dedicated to language learning before they get into everything else, right? Start there. Spend the solid year focusing on that. And then as the established and the more experienced person, I would argue that the weight falls a bit more on the veteran to be gracious because of one difference, one asymmetry here. And that is that the newcomer is going through culture shock and you aren't. So for you now, it's home, it's comfortable, it's known. For them, it's all strange. And therefore, if sharp things get said, or I don't know, just things get said that aren't the best, give them a little space and expect that. And just recognize they're going through this right now. That's okay. Once the culture shock wears off and they've adjusted more now, a suggestion here would be to let them have a place at the table, let them be part of things. And specifically because of the sacrifices that they made, they moved their family across the world. You want to let them be part of things. Okay, all of those points I give as sort of suggestions. Basically, it was really easy to write that. The way I wrote that was I thought through the things that my team did for me and that I really appreciated. And so take it in that kind of vein, that these were things that were just a blessing and that I'm grateful for in the people that I work with. The next is to think of team relationships under the metaphor of marriage. And again, I got this from a group that I had talked to, one mission field that we had been at. And the joke on this mission field was that ministry relationships, mission team relationships, it's just like marriage, except it's all the good parts left out, and you don't get to pick who you marry. And that's a bit of a cynical expression of it, but maybe in the sense that so you're making decisions together where it affects both of you deeply, right? So you have to work together as a group to come up with this decision, and it's going to affect everybody's life. But then the things that the other person does, you may not have any say, right? And so you're very much dependent on each other. Some of the things that you care most deeply about in your ministry and your life are shared things. So you move your family across the world to do ministry. You move your family across the world to be part of this specific endeavor. And if one member of the team slips up and blows it, and we hope this doesn't happen, a person destroys their testimony and becomes an awful picture of failure. Okay, all of us suffer. All of us are affected by one person's failure. And so that means that your life is deeply affected by other people's decisions. And there's nothing you can do necessarily to control those decisions, right? You've got things that will deeply affect you and you have no control over them. I recognize that. So I'm going to give you some examples here of things that would be potential bombs or potential tensions within a team relationship. And I want to clarify here before I even go into them, just to say, really, again, I came up with these examples more from things I've heard anecdotally, people talking about. So these are not things that have been part of my personal life. So don't hear these things as something that, as part of our team. It's just things that you hear about, things that happen and that people talk about. So here's an example that could happen. You arrive and the team that's there rejoices because finally you've come and finally you've given them relief. And so now they have this long list of ministries they want you to take. Maybe even you arrive and a month later they leave on furlough. That would be not ideal. Don't do that to somebody. But it happens. Okay, you wanted to do language school first and you were committed to it. But then this missionary is exhausted because they've been holding out and they've not taken a furlough for 8 years because they had no one to replace them. You're here. I can take my furlough now. So then how are you going to handle that? Like where do you set aside your ideals for the language learning, but also maintain the relationship? Okay. It's going to be tricky. You're going to have to coordinate your furloughs with everyone else. Okay, well, this is reality. I mean, we do this in our team. Before I make a furlough decision, the first people I'm asking are my teammates. I mean, I'll ask my, sorry, maybe this is wrong. I'll ask my teammates before I ask GFA because it affects my teammates so much, right? And if my teammates check off, yeah, that'll work. That's okay. But then second step, GFA is just okay. Just because my choice to leave means that their workload, whatever I was doing, is on them. Okay? And so I just dropped a workload on the rest of the team. And therefore, to make sure that I'm coordinating that, it's critical. Another point that could come up is attention. You might leave a ministry, go back on furlough, and while you're gone, let's say church plant, your coworker has a different philosophy and method than you would. And so he ends up implementing some of this in your ministry. And when you get back, he's created precedents and there's expectations and things that people think it should work a certain way. And you wouldn't have done it that way. He did something different than you would have chosen. Okay, but it was your ministry. And yeah, how do you view some of that? Or something you worked hard on while you're gone kind of gets turned a new direction. You have a joint project. And you have shared money and you have shared costs. Okay? But reality, some people are going to have different priorities for the way that they use the money. Some people might even fail to steward the money well. Right? One guy just pours the money out. Hey, the money's here. We got to use it for the kingdom of God. Let's do something with this. And the other guy feels like everything should be constrained. Okay? So then your efforts to cut expenses cuts into priorities. And after then you've, maybe trimmed everything back to try to save this little bit of money, the guy comes in and wants to spend the money on some priority that doesn't matter to you. Okay. So how do you work through that? How do you come to conclusions that are going to work for both of you? Okay. These are things that could happen. These are things I hear about happening in different places. And just to recognize some of that before you hit those things. Okay. So now that's maybe a little bit negative. Let's process then how we ought to respond or how we work through some of this. And here I'm going to give 2 points fitting together. Don't sweat the details, but when it comes to the core, the fundamentals, sweat the fundamentals. Right? Don't worry so much about the details, but get worried when it comes to fundamentals. Here's the details piece of this, and I'd love to build this idea out, but I'll have to trim it down a bit. I talked about this idea earlier. Within a monocultural setting, you're living in the US, you're part of a church body and so forth. It's a little easier to just copy paste. So this is what that family does, so let's do that too. Okay, and we understand, even within a US monocultural setting in a church, there are lots of differences still. The idea just goes, you drop a group of people into a culture that's not their birth culture, and they kind of have to reinvent the wheel and figure out solutions for all of this. And they will come to different conclusions. Okay, here's the piece of it. They've spent a lot of time thinking about that, hopefully anyway. So they had to process it in a way that the US-based person never did really process so much. They just copy-pasted. But this person got dropped into a new culture and they had to think from ground zero. And so they worked through and they got done and they said, here are my reasons why we do X, Y, Z. And they believe it on the deep level of a philosophy, okay? But the other guy also believes it deeply on the level of a philosophy, and he came to a different conclusion. See? And so within the groups or the families, how do you mesh all of this when we believe strongly in our conclusions and we really like what we've chosen to do? Obviously, you've chosen, so you like it. And so you put all of that together with the layer that I said earlier, the heroic missionary expectations, and you really do have a recipe for disaster. Specific examples like this, Again, just processing differences that can happen. Some of these are differences within our team here. Numbers of others would not be. But here, if one family chooses to have a car and another family chooses to ride buses and use public, who's the better missionary? If one family rents a Western-style home with a pool for $900 a month, and another family moves into a squatter community where the rent is $70 a month, who's the better steward of support funds? Okay, I've known specific settings, not here, where that exact dynamic happened between two teammates in one group, right? So who's going to pat themselves on the back? I'm being a better steward of support funds. I don't know. If one family eats rice every meal, obviously assuming Asian context, and another pays the upcharge to eat imported Western food, is one of the families better enculturated than the other? Should missionaries have nice technology because it's an effective tool for getting things done? Or do you keep it simple so you aren't flashing around your wealth so that you can stay more local if you're in a developing context? Do you like technology or are you suspicious of technology? How quickly should you indigenize, meaning hand over a ministry to national leadership? Do you really need to learn the local language, sometimes in a semi-English-y kind of context like mine or other places in former British colonies? They speak quasi-English. Okay, should you learn the language? Do you need to? Teammates might feel differently. Should you be conservative and save large amounts of money, retirement? Or should you just trust the Lord to supply? Same thing with the specific ministry. Should you try to save money for the ministry or just spend it as you get it? And here's maybe the kicker for all of these. How do you personally handle it when the nationals give you their evaluation of each person's relative indigenization fitting in? And that's going to happen. People will say to you, I really like that your family does, or how come that family over there doesn't do, or I noticed the difference, and they will say that, right? So does that convince you if the nationals tell you you're doing a great job, you're a better missionary? Do you listen to it? And the old advice was that missionaries should beware of nationals dividing them through comparisons. I don't know that it's that dark. I don't think that nationals are necessarily trying to trip you up or something. I think it's natural. They're just making comparisons, and I don't blame them necessarily in a way. Okay. But here would be the superior or the proper way to process that. It's just different. It's just different, and that's okay. People are allowed to be different. Okay. In some of the cases I just set up above, should you learn the language or not? There is a superior thing. The answer is yes, you should. I mean, there is a superior, inferior. So there is an ideal and a sub-ideal, okay? But newsflash, which one of us is an ideal anything, right? And none of us are an ideal anything. So in this area, good for you, someone might be a little stronger over here. But don't forget the other 95 areas where I'm weak. And the reality between comparisons like that, if I only make it monofactorial and I just zoom in on that one thing, then yeah, I can convince myself I'm a better missionary because of X, Y, and Z. Don't forget about the rest of that guy's life. Let people be people. Let people make their own mistakes. Let people fall short of being the ideal missionary, because I certainly am. All of us certainly are short of the ideal. Let families each have their own way of handling the adjustment and making change. It's even possible to still hold to your ideals and to believe philosophically in the things that you believe in, while recognizing that there might be another way to accomplish the same good. Stop thinking of missionaries, and this would be critical for all of us, to not think through the heroic model. None of us are heroes, for sure. But here, fundamentally, we just love God. We live right, do good work, be a blessing to the people around us, right? That's enough. That'll do. And in the meantime, then we get along with the people around us and recognize that all of us are sub-ideal. Okay, that's then on the things that we don't want to sweat. So don't sweat the details. But how about this? Sweat the core fundamental pre-commitments. And what I mean here, ideally, really, what you're shooting for before you join a team. Before you join a team, you really want to know that you're on the same page on the fundamentals. Okay. So we believe that theologically that sanctification is real. People can change. There can be drastic change in people's life. We also recognize realistically, they don't usually. And so on the very basic level, the time to work through differences and pre-commitments is probably before you join the team. And before you join the team, if the person is so different in their philosophy or so different in their method working in their context, they're so different that it's not going to merge. Don't expect them to change. I mean, that would be great, but assume that it doesn't change. And so the question to ask before you jump in is to evaluate, is this a thing I can live with? Assuming that it's static, assuming that it never changes, can I live with this? If you can't, that's probably not going to be a functioning team for you. And I say all of this because the reason I think that our team relationships here have been such a blessing is because we do very much share these pre-commitments. So when we're sitting around the table and we're talking through a decision, specific thing we're going to do or not do, the fundamentals we already agree on. And therefore, it's really easy to just work through the details. We have differences. I mean, things come up and we talk through them. But the fundamentals already there are the same and set. Okay, last point, and then I'll just go to conclusion. But here, one more suggestion that's a practical suggestion. Spend time with your coworkers, but not too much time. And I'm going to give you here a diagram. It's just a couple of circles and some arrows. My idea of this goes, okay, you want the relationship to work well, obviously. So you're really trying to make this relationship work. And so you could process it something like, if this relationship falls apart, everything falls apart. And therefore, we've got to let's start with this relationship, get this relationship right, and then we'll move on to the ministry goals that we have. And that would be my diagram that's on the left side, the circles where the arrows are pointing towards each other. So in this case, then, the circles basically end up orbiting each other, right? It's just, no, it's a self-fulfilling, this is an end to itself. Versus the arrows on the right, where you've got two people that are set on the same goals, and they're going to move towards those same goals. This is, again, why before you're setting up the team, you're making sure the pre-commitments are already worked through, that you have the same goals. Okay, but two people that have the same goals are going to find it a lot easier to get along because they're already moving the same direction. And the relationships are not necessarily a self-fulfilling end in themselves and so forth. We know where we're going, okay? And therefore, the relationship is, in some ways, just in a means to the end, which is serving the Lord, okay? So where that goes, spend time with your coworkers, but no reason to make that an end in itself. We didn't move across the world and move to the Philippines so that we could spend all of our time with Americans. I love our coworkers, and I view them as friends, very close friends. But I didn't come here to do that, really. I mean, I know where I could find a lot of Americans to hang out with, and that would be in the U.S. Okay? I came over here to minister to Filipinos, and they did too. So where that works out then is I need to spend some time with them. If we don't talk, misunderstandings will happen. It'll percolate. Resentments will happen. It'll just get worse, right? If you want to think family reunions as a metaphor, you're always really glad to get back together with the family and you want to see them all again. But if you've ever done like a week-long family reunion, by the end of the week, you're kind of ready to go back home and just be you a bit. Okay. Think that you want to spend time, but not too much time. Where that works out for us, we have annual retreats where we get together for 3 days and we share a lot of stuff. We celebrate the 4th of July, we celebrate Christmas, and then we get together. The men will get together weekly and we work through practical administrative kind of things. So we're talking all the time, but we don't have to spend so much time that the annoyances accumulate. We're able to spend the right amount of time, and that really helps. Spending time, but not too much time, would be part of making this work. Okay, I'm going to end here with the most fundamental foundation for this is just relationships. So what I say in here could be anything. It's not mission specific at all. It's just relationships. I really like this book, When Sinners Say I Do by Dave Harvey. It's my favorite marriage book because the book could be just as easily When Sinners Go to the Mission Field Together. It doesn't, it's marriage specific, and he'll give illustrations and such. But basically, he just connects marriage to the gospel. You're a sinner, you're a mess, you're in a terrible place, but Jesus saved you. And so that framework then drives the way that you think about yourself and your spouse. Okay. So that kind of concept, that could be a great book to read just for this, to help us process the fundamental, which is the end of all relational issues will ultimately have to be the fruit of the Spirit. So if you don't get that right, nothing else works. And therefore that then becomes the defining for all of the others. And 3 specific points where that works out. Honestly, I'm not just saying, honestly, the way I wrote these points was I thought about my coworkers and what I've just been so appreciative of seeing and how they work with me. Number 1, be truly humble. Esteem others higher than yourselves. That means that you doubt your opinions, even when you're fairly sure that you're right, you still doubt. Because assuming others are better than yourself assumes that they probably have an idea in the back of their heads that makes sense of whatever they just said or did. There's a reason they did that. It's not because they're an evil person. Grow in wisdom. This is kind of a concept of, never stop learning. That means that you never believe you've settled on the only right view for all of time. It means you never stop learning. It means that you're truly open to looking at things completely different, with the caveat, of course, you're constrained to biblical categories. Okay, but there might be 6 other ways to solve this cultural problem, and that's good too. And so there might be differences between you and them, but they have reasons for what they're doing, and those are good reasons. And then the last, be always ready to hear. Wait a long time before you say something, and don't get angry. Okay, if you recognize that, all I did, I paraphrased the be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. Because if I just put in the verse, you're like, okay, that verse, yeah, okay. But if I rewrite it in English that we are not immediately recognizing as a verse, then all of a sudden we go, oh, yeah, okay, so there we are, right? Wait, be 90% ear, 10% mouth, even though I've been running my mouth for an entire hour here. Wait a long time before you say something, and don't respond. Don't emotionally respond when things are frustrating at first. Okay, that's it. As far as things I said, Dr. Patterson, if we have time to ask questions, I'm happy to, or however you want to handle it from here. Thank you. It was very enjoyable to talk about this, and I'd love to put up behind me the pictures of my coworkers, because it's from them that I'm pulling most of this information, just watching and observing them. So thank you. Thank you to all of you for your time. Okay, good night. Thank you.